Sonny Hostin has never had an identity crisis. Puerto Rican and African American, raised in the South Bronx, certain of exactly where she came from, that was the story, and she told it without hesitation for decades. Then the DNA results arrived, and the certainty held, but the story underneath it turned out to be far larger than the labels had ever indicated. What the science uncovered reached back through 5 centuries and across 3 continents, and some of it had no name she had ever been given. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and subscribe. She grew up in the South Bronx at a time when the neighborhood was not an easy place to grow up. The 1970s and early 1980s stripped the neighborhood down to something raw: arson, poverty, abandonment, a city that had largely decided to look elsewhere. What survived in communities like hers was something harder to quantify than infrastructure, a sense of identity specific enough to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. For Asuncion Cummings, that identity had 2 components, and she knew both of them by name. Her mother, Rosa, was Puerto Rican. Her father, William, was African American. That combination was not unusual in the South Bronx. The neighborhood had been shaped by the same Great Migration and Caribbean diaspora that had brought hundreds of thousands of people into New York over the previous half-century. But for Hostin, it was not demographic data, it was the ground she stood on. She carried it forward into every room she entered, through Wesleyan University and Notre Dame Law School, through her years as a federal prosecutor, through the pivot to television that made her one of the most recognizable voices on daytime news. The Puerto Rican and African American identity was not something she wore selectively or deployed strategically. It was how she understood herself and how she presented herself consistently across 3 decades of public life. That kind of settled self-knowledge is not nothing. It takes time to build, and it is built from real things: language, food, family, neighborhood, the specific texture of a community that formed you. The categories Hostin carried were not abstract. They were attached to actual people and actual places and an actual history she could point to. What the DNA test would eventually complicate was not that history. The people were real. The community was real. What the science added was everything that had happened before those categories existed. The longer story, that the labels Puerto Rican and African American had been quietly containing all along, without anyone in the family having fully looked inside them. Puerto Rican is not a genetic category. It is a political and cultural one. And the difference matters more than most people carrying the identity have reason to examine. The island's population did not emerge from a single source. It was produced by 5 centuries of collision between peoples who arrived by force, by conquest, and by circumstance. And the genetic result of that collision is one of the most complex population profiles in the Western Hemisphere. The Taino were there first. When Spanish ships arrived in 1493, the island they called Borinquen had been inhabited for thousands of years by people with their own languages, agricultural systems, and political structures. Within a century of contact, the Taino population had been reduced by disease, forced labor, and violence to a fraction of what it had been. Spanish colonial records declared them effectively extinct by the mid-16th century. The declaration was premature, and as DNA research has since suggested, not entirely accurate, but the damage to Taino cultural and demographic continuity was severe enough that their genetic legacy in modern Puerto Rican families is fragmented, unevenly distributed, and in many cases below the threshold that current testing can confidently identify. The African presence arrived through the Atlantic slave trade, which brought enslaved West Africans to Puerto Rico beginning in the early 16th century and continued for more than 300 years. By the time slavery was abolished on the island in 1873, the African genetic contribution to Puerto Rico's population was substantial and deeply embedded. It did not distribute itself evenly. Some families carry it prominently. Others carry it in ways that family tradition never acknowledged and that only a laboratory would eventually surface. The Spanish colonial strand is the third component, but Spanish in this context is itself a simplification. The settlers who came to Puerto Rico over 4 centuries were not a homogeneous population. They brought regional Spanish identities, converso Jewish lineages, and the genetic traces of centuries of movement across the Mediterranean world. What all of this means is that a DNA test applied to a Puerto Rican family is not reading a single heritage. It is reading a compressed archive of colonial history, and what that archive contains is rarely what the family expected. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has spent the better part of 2 decades turning DNA ancestry testing into television. That description undersells what finding your roots actually is. The series is a research project with a production budget, a genealogical investigation that combines documentary archival work with genetic analysis at a level of sophistication that consumer ancestry tests do not approach. The celebrities who sit across from Gates are not receiving a printout from a kit they mailed in. They are receiving the results of a multi-layered scientific analysis that their family histories could not have produced any other way. Hostin was among the participants. What she brought to the process was different from the blank space participants the series had featured before. She did not arrive unaware. She arrived knowing precisely, or believing she did, and the investigation was being applied not to fill a void, but to examine something she had always assumed was already fully understood. The methodology. Gates's team layered 3 distinct forms of genetic evidence. Autosomal DNA produced the broad ethnic percentages, the proportional breakdown of ancestry across all lines, paternal and maternal, reaching back several generations. Mitochondrial DNA traced the direct maternal line, unchanged across generations, to its ancient point of origin. Where applicable, Y chromosome analysis extended the same precision to the direct paternal line. Together, the 3 layers produced a picture that no single form of analysis could provide alone. For a subject with Puerto Rican ancestry, the autosomal analysis carried a particular methodological challenge. Puerto Rico's genetic complexity means that reference population databases need to be exceptionally detailed to distinguish between the island's African, European, and indigenous strands with any precision. A database that works well for a subject with straightforward West African or Western European ancestry can produce blurred results when applied to a population that has been mixing those strands for 5 centuries. Gates's team had the depth to handle it, what they could not guarantee, and what Gates has always been careful to acknowledge on camera was that the results would confirm what the subject had come in believing. For Hostin, that caveat would turn out to matter. The African ancestry results came back substantial. That was not surprising, given her father's background in Puerto Rico's history. A significant African genetic presence was the one finding nobody needed a laboratory to anticipate. What the results added was something the cultural label had never been able to provide: specificity. The DNA identified genetic affiliations with West Africa. It included connections to peoples from the region that now encompasses Nigeria and neighboring coastal areas, communities that sat at the center of one of the most heavily trafficked corridors of the Atlantic slave trade. The Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra together fed an enormous portion of the enslaved people carried across the Atlantic over 3 centuries. The ethnic groups whose descendants cluster genetically in that region, Yoruba, Igbo, and others, are not peripheral figures in the history of the African diaspora. They are among its primary sources. What that identification does is replace a direction with a destination. West Africa as a general origin tells you approximately where a ship departed from. A genetic affiliation with specific coastal populations tells you something about the particular human communities that were disrupted, separated, and scattered. Those are the peoples whose languages, spiritual traditions, and social structures crossed the Atlantic in fragmented form and left traces in African American and Afro-Caribbean culture that scholars have spent generations trying to document. For Hostin, the African ancestry arrived through 2 distinct channels simultaneously: Her father's African-American lineage carried it directly, the product of generations of American history stretching back through slavery to the West African coast. Her Puerto Rican mother's family carried it separately, the result of the Atlantic slave trade's parallel operation in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans were brought to Puerto Rico beginning in the early 16th century and remaining a central part of the island's population for more than 300 years. Two pathways, the same deep origin. The DNA was not telling her something she could not have reason toward. It was confirming the specific geography of a history she had always known existed, and the confirmation carried a weight that reasoning alone had never quite produced. The European ancestry results were the ones that complicated the story she had always told. Not because European ancestry was unexpected. Puerto Rican heritage almost universally includes a Spanish colonial thread, and Hostin had never claimed otherwise. But the DNA broke that thread down into components that the word Spanish had always been too broad to contain, and what it found inside that category added dimensions the family narrative had no language for. The dominant strand was Iberian, consistent with the Spanish colonial history that brought settlers to Puerto Rico beginning in the late 15th century. That part landed where expected. What sat alongside it was more textured. The European ancestry and Hostin's results carried signals consistent with populations from across the broader Mediterranean world, the genetic evidence of centuries of movement, conversion, and migration that had shaped the Iberian Peninsula long before Spanish ships reached the Caribbean. Among the threads researchers identified was evidence consistent with Sephardic Jewish ancestry. This is not an unusual finding in Puerto Rican DNA analysis. The Spanish Inquisition produced a wave of forced conversions and expulsions beginning in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, and that movement sent converso Jewish families across the Spanish Empire, including to its Caribbean colonies, where distance from Madrid offered a measure of insulation from the Inquisition's reach. Their descendants intermarried into the colonial population over generations, and the genetic evidence of that absorption surfaces in Puerto Rican ancestry results often enough that researchers have noted it as a pattern rather than an anomaly. For Hostin, this finding arrived not as a contradiction of her known heritage, but as an extension of it, a thread running through the Spanish colonial ancestry she had always claimed, adding a layer the cultural label had never surfaced. What the European results also confirmed was the complexity of the colonial history embedded in Puerto Rican identity. The settlers who shaped the island's population were not a uniform group. They carried their own histories of displacement, survival, and forced reinvention. In that sense, the convergence the DNA revealed was not only racial, it was historical, and the deepest convergence was still to come. The Taino question was the one Hostin had carried longest. Not as a scientific hypothesis, she had never framed it that way, but as a piece of inherited self-understanding that Puerto Rican families passed down alongside everything else. The indigenous thread was part of the story. It had always been part of the story. What the DNA test was now being asked to do was confirm what the family had always assumed was simply there. The results were more complicated than a yes or no. The science of confirming Taino ancestry specifically is constrained in ways that other ancestry analyses are not. The Taino population collapse following Spanish colonization was so severe that no large modern Taino reference population exists for genetic comparison. Researchers working on Puerto Rican ancestry cannot measure a subject's DNA against a robust database of Taino descendants the way they can measure West African or Iberian ancestry against well-documented reference populations. What they can identify is indigenous American ancestry more broadly, genetic signals consistent with pre-Columbian populations in the Caribbean and surrounding regions. Whether that signal traces specifically to the Taino or to indigenous populations from the mainland whose genetic presence entered Puerto Rico through other routes is a distinction the current science cannot always make with confidence. Hostin's results showed an indigenous American genetic signal. What the analysis could not do was certify it as specifically Taino, with the precision that would make it genealogically definitive. Gates addressed this directly, not to dismiss the finding, but to frame it accurately. The signal was real. The label attached to it required more caution than the family tradition had applied. That distinction matters. It is the difference between what the DNA can responsibly claim and what the cultural inheritance has long assumed. For a community whose indigenous identity was nearly erased by the same colonial forces the DNA was now tracing, the inability to confirm the Taino connection with full scientific precision carries its own particular weight. What the results had established, taken together, was a portrait far more layered than two ethnic labels could hold. The final and deepest layer of that portrait was still waiting to be read. Mitochondrial DNA runs on a different timeline than the rest of the ancestry picture. The autosomal results, the percentages, the ethnic breakdowns, the population affiliations describe a genetic composite assembled across many generations, reaching back several centuries at most. The mitochondrial line goes further. It does not blend, does not dilute, does not absorb contributions from fathers or paternal lines. It passes from mother to daughter intact, carrying a signature that has remained essentially unchanged since it was first established in a specific woman, in a specific place, at a point in human history that long predates any of the colonial forces the earlier results had been tracing. Hostin's mitochondrial haplogroup traced her direct maternal line, her mother's mother's mother, extending back without interruption to a West African origin. The specific haplogroup branch identified placed her maternal ancestry within a lineage that has been present in West and Central Africa for thousands of years, predating the Atlantic slave trade, predating Spanish colonization of the Caribbean, predating every political and geographic category that the rest of her ancestry results had been organized around. What that means for the story the DNA had been assembling is significant. The maternal line running through Hostin's Puerto Rican family, the line she inherited from her mother, Rosa, who inherited it from her mother, and so on back through the generations, does not originate in Spain or an indigenous Borin Quinn. It originates in Africa. The Puerto Rican identity that Hostin carried as one half of her heritage turns out, at its deepest maternal root, to share its origin with the African American identity she carried as the other half. The two strands she had always understood as distinct components of who she was converge at the level of the direct maternal line into a single ancient source. That convergence does not collapse the distinction between her Puerto Rican and African American identities. Those identities were formed by different histories, different communities, and different experiences of what it meant to be a particular kind of person in a particular kind of America, but it adds a dimension to the picture that no family narrative had ever captured, and it sets up the question the final chapter has to answer. The complete picture that emerged was not the one Hostin had carried into the process. It was larger, older, and more tangled, not in a way that displaced what she knew, but in a way that revealed how much the labels she had always used were containing without her knowing it. Puerto Rican and African American. Two categories, both real, both earned through lived experience, family history, and the particular texture of a South Bronx childhood. The DNA did not invalidate either of them. What it did was open them up, show the historical sediment that had accumulated inside each one over centuries of colonial movement, forced migration, and survival. West African ancestry ran through both strands simultaneously, arriving through her father's American lineage and through her mother's Puerto Rican one, converging in her genome from two directions that had been geographically separated for centuries before producing a child in the Bronx in 1968. The Iberian European ancestry carried threads that predated the Spanish Empire itself. Sephardic Jewish lineages absorbed into the colonial population across generations of forced reinvention. The indigenous signal was present, but resistant to the precise label the family tradition had always attached to it. And the direct maternal line, traced to its ancient West African origin, dissolved the boundary between the two halves of her identity at the deepest genetic level available to science. She came into this knowing who she was, That did not change. What changed was the resolution of the picture, the granularity available to her now that documents and family memory had never been able to provide. The certainty she had always carried turned out to be accurate as far as it went. It just had not gone far enough. That is the particular experience that DNA ancestry testing produces for people who already have an answer. It does not replace the story. It extends it backward into territory the story had never reached, into histories that the categories we use to describe ourselves were built on top of without anyone thinking to look at the foundation. The foundation, it turns out, runs deeper than the building above it. What the DNA confirmed is that the identity Hostin built was never as simple as two labels suggested, and that the complexity was always there, waiting inside the categories rather than hidden behind them. West African ancestry running through both sides simultaneously, a Sephardic thread folded into the colonial Spanish line, an indigenous signal that science can detect but not yet fully name. The specific people behind all of it remain unrecoverable, but the story she told about herself for decades turned out to be true. It was just larger than she knew.